Maybe the conflict isn't where you think it is, but in the way you're observing. How often do we believe the problem lies in the other person? In what they said, in what they did, in how they acted. We spend days, even years, trying to understand, justify, or change someone, and yet the discomfort remains. It's as if, no matter how much the situation changes, something inside us still keeps vibrating. But what if I told you that the true point of transformation isn't in convincing, confronting, or correcting, but in the way you're looking, in how your consciousness is positioned in front of what it sees? There is a powerful secret hidden in observation, because when you change the way you observe, you alter the field where everything unfolds. Today, you'll learn how to shift conflict without arguing, without forcing, without needing to prove your point. You'll discover how to silently dissolve tension by changing nothing but your state of presence, the quality of your attention, and the internal space from which you observe others and yourself. Because every conflict is, above all, a reading of reality, and every reading can be rewritten when the observer awakens. This is today's invitation to access the hidden power of your observation and discover that peace begins where judgment ends. Why observation is the first field where conflict begins. When you enter into conflict with someone, it might seem like everything started in that moment, with a sharp word, a hurtful action, or a silence that felt like rejection. But the truth is, the conflict didn't begin with what the other person did. It began with what you saw and what they did. It started with observation, and that observation almost always happens unconsciously, loaded with judgment, interpretation, past memories, and unresolved emotions. Every human relationship is an energetic exchange. What you observe in the other is not only seen with your eyes, it's felt by the field. It's as if your gaze emits a subtle frequency that shapes how the interaction unfolds. When you look at someone with judgment, even silently, that frequency creates resistance. The field of the relationship closes. The other person senses, even unconsciously, that they're being analyzed, measured, criticized, and this activates defense, attack, or withdrawal mechanisms. Your observation is not neutral. It carries a vibrational tone, and that tone determines whether the space between you and the other will be one of conflict or connection. You might remember a time when you tried to talk to someone about something delicate, but the conversation quickly turned into an argument. Maybe you seemed calm on the outside, but inwardly, your observation was charged with hurt, expectations, or resentment. And the other person responded not only to what you said, but to what you were transmitting without realizing. The way you were observing them triggered a reaction in the field, and that's where everything becomes clear. The conflict began not with words or actions, but with the way the other was seen. When you observe someone with empathy, something shifts. The field opens. It's like an invisible bridge begins to form between you and the other person. Empathy and observation doesn't mean agreeing, accepting everything, or abandoning yourself. It simply means recognizing that there is something more beyond the surface, that this person, even while behaving in a difficult way, is dealing with their own wounds, mechanisms, and stories. When that awareness begins to vibrate within you, the field responds with more ease. The other person feels that they are being seen differently, and often that's enough for them to shift too. Observation is the first field because it precedes every reaction. It sets the emotional tone of the exchange. It either ignites or soothes the flames of conflict. And when you become aware of your observation, when you notice that you're seeing the other through a lens distorted by pain or the past, you can choose something new. You can breathe, come back to yourself, and observe with presence, with curiosity, with the intention to understand. This change may seem subtle, but it's deep, because in the energetic universe, the intention behind your observation is more powerful than the words you speak. It's picked up by the field, processed through emotion, and answered by the other person's unconscious. So peace doesn't begin with conversation. It begins with your vision. It begins when you choose to see beyond the defense, the mistake, or the threat, and recognize the human being who, though imperfect, is doing their best to deal with their own shadows. The way you observe others changes the relational field. Sometimes all you want is for the other person to change, to listen, to respect, to understand you, to recognize what they did, to become more aware of their own actions. And that desire can come from a real place, from the wish for lighter, more genuine connections. But there's something subtle, almost invisible, that often goes unnoticed. The way you're looking at that person, the way you see them in the silence of your mind. Have you noticed how, when you label someone internally, your whole body starts to react according to that label? When you see someone as a problem, your field becomes defensive. When you see them as a threat, your energy closes. When you see them as an obstacle, your presence vibrates in tension. And this vibration, even if you say nothing, already communicates something to the other person. Because the field between two people is sensitive, intelligent, and responsive. It responds to your gaze before it responds to your words. The most striking thing is realizing that your observation creates realities. You feed the version of the other person that you choose to see. If you see someone as rigid, distant, selfish, and stay focused on that, that version tends to solidify. Not because the other is limited to that, but because your gaze becomes a mirror that only reflects that part. And the more you observe them through the lens of judgment or pain, the more you reinforce exactly what hurts you. But there is a turning point, and it begins when you decide to release the other from the prison of your own projection, when you create inner space to see beyond the behavior, beyond the moment, when you observe them as a human being in process, imperfect, yes, but also on a journey with their wounds, their lessons, their limits, and their light. This shift in the quality of your observation changes the relational field. The other person feels it. They may not be able to explain why, but they sense something has softened in the air. They sense that, somehow, they've been seen more fully, more humanely. And that alone is often what allows them to let their guard down, to show vulnerability, or even to change their behavior. Because the field has shifted, and the field responds to the consciousness that holds it. You don't need to pretend you weren't hurt, or ignore behaviors that harmed you, but you can choose a broader lens, a lens that doesn't deny what was lived, but also doesn't reduce the other to a single moment of failure. This isn't about making excuses. It's about freeing your vision so it doesn't trap you in the same repeating pattern. It's about recognizing that the most powerful change doesn't come from getting the other to behave the way you want, but from transforming the frequency with which you see them. The way you look at the other shapes what's possible between you. And when you change that gaze, even without saying a word, you've already begun a new narrative. A new relational field begins to form. And in this new space, the other person may, if they want to, if they're ready, respond differently. Maybe they won't change. Maybe they'll keep acting the same. But you change. And by changing, you no longer feed the version of pain. You choose to see with awareness. And that in itself is liberation. The neutral observer, the key to dissolving attack. There is a space within you where everything can be seen without judgment, a silent, present, attentive point. That space is the neutral observer, and it is one of the most powerful keys to dissolving conflict before it becomes attack. As long as we're trapped in automatic reaction, emotional interpretation, or the need to defend our point of view, conflict feeds itself. But when we access this state of conscious neutrality, something extraordinary happens. The tension field loses strength, the attack finds no resistance, and the cycle of pain begins to unravel. It's not easy, I know. When someone hurts us, when we feel wronged or threatened, everything inside us screams for a response. The mind rushes to interpret. That was disrespect, selfishness, contempt. And before we can even choose how to act, we're already reacting. But reaction is just the repetition of an old pattern. It comes from stored memories, unhealed wounds, and unquestioned conditioning. The neutral observer breaks this cycle. Being in neutrality doesn't mean being passive, accepting abuse, or pretending everything is fine. It means being present enough to see, without becoming lost in what you're seeing. It means noticing the emotion arriving, but choosing not to merge with it. It means witnessing what the other person is expressing without immediately filtering it through your own personal pain. And that's not coldness, it's energetic maturity. The field of a neutral observer has a clear, steady, and quiet vibration. When you're in that state, the other person senses that there's no enemy there. They sense they're not being attacked or judged, and that disarms their impulse to defend or confront. Many times, the simple presence of someone observing with awareness already transforms the atmosphere. A conversation that could have exploded becomes possible. A disagreement that seemed unsolvable begins to soften. To access this state, you must cultivate the pause. Yes, the pause. A moment of conscious breathing before you react. A second of presence before you interpret. It's in that subtle space that the observer awakens. And in that awakening, consciousness chooses not to replay the old script. Presence becomes stronger than impulse. Clarity becomes louder than fear. In the heat of the moment, your mind may shout, "Respond! Prove your point, defend yourself." But if you can breathe, quiet down inside, and observe what's really happening within you, within the other, in the space between, you access a new dimension of response. Not the automatic response, but the conscious one. The response that doesn't seek to win, but to understand. That doesn't need to control, but simply holds presence. The power of the neutral observer lies right here. It doesn't need to act to transform. Its mere presence shifts the vibration of the field. Because where there is no fight, attack finds no ground. Where there is no judgment, pain loses its echo. And where there is consciousness, the cycle of conflict begins to dissolve. You don't need to always be right. You don't need to win arguments. What you truly need is to be awake, to be whole, to be present enough not to be swept away by someone else's storm or your own. How your inner conflicts are also born from repeated observation. Not all conflict shows up in the words exchanged with others. Many of the deepest battles happen in silence, inside you. They are those internal dialogues filled with criticism, guilt, comparison, and doubt. Moments when you observe yourself harshly, as if you were never enough, always failing, always falling short. And what many people don't realize is that this inner conflict also begins with observation. With the way you've been looking at yourself day after day. You are constantly observing yourself, and the quality of that observation determines how you feel in your own skin. When the gaze you turn inward is fixated on finding flaws, you feel small. When it's trapped in old stories of guilt or shame, you see yourself as undeserving of love, of forgiveness, of a fresh start. Over time, this repeated observation becomes an identity. You begin to believe you are what you see, not realizing you're simply seeing through a distorted lens. It's like standing in front of a fogged-up mirror and drawing conclusions about who you are. That mirror is formed by voices you've internalized throughout life, other people's criticisms, societal pressures, unhealed traumas. And every time you observe yourself from that place, you reinforce an image that does not reflect the fullness of who you are. Inner conflict feeds off this unconscious repetition. You feel at war with yourself, but in truth, you're at war with the way you've been observing yourself. Maybe you live with thoughts like, "I should be stronger. I never get it right. I can't change." These thoughts don't come from nowhere. They are the result of an observation that is crystallized inside you. They are mental trails you've walked so many times. They feel like natural paths, but they're not. They're patterns, and patterns can be broken. When you begin to change the way you observe yourself, something deeply healing begins. You start to realize you are not your failure, not your mistake, not your past. You are a person in process, just like everyone else. And more than that, you are someone who can choose to observe yourself with compassion, with presence, with truth. And that changes everything. Because emotional healing begins when your gaze becomes kinder. It's not about denying what needs to improve. It's about not using your own gaze as a weapon. It's possible to acknowledge your shadows without harming yourself with them. To embrace your limitations without defining yourself by them. When you change the way you see yourself, the past doesn't disappear, but the weight you carry it with begins to lift. This shift in perspective isn't instant. It's a practice, a new habit of presence. It begins when you notice you're judging yourself, when you breathe before condemning yourself, when you ask, am I seeing myself through the eyes of someone who hurt me, or through the eyes of who I want to become? And little by little, this new inner observer gains strength, an observer who doesn't abandon you in hard moments, who doesn't reduce you to your mistakes, who sees you as a soul on a journey. Inner conflict dissolves when your gaze becomes an ally, when you consciously choose to step out of the role of judge and into the space of compassionate witness. That doesn't eliminate the challenges, but it radically changes how you live through them. Because now, instead of fighting yourself, you walk with yourself. Alignment technique, observing others with elevated consciousness. The way you observe another person can become either a bridge of healing or a gap of separation. It all depends on the quality of your presence and the vibration of your consciousness. When we speak of observing with elevated consciousness, we're referring to a state of attention that goes beyond the conditioned mind, beyond automatic judgment, beyond the filter of pain. It's a gaze that comes from the soul, one that recognizes the light even when it's hidden beneath difficult behaviors. It's a kind of observation that silently transforms the energy between you and the other. This alignment technique begins within. Before you look outward, you must return inward. Deep breathing helps break the automatic cycle of reactivity. It anchors your presence in the now and opens space for a new perception. When you calm yourself internally, your vision expands. And through this expansion, you begin to see beyond the character the other is playing in that moment. You start to intuit what lies behind the harsh words, the emotional shutdown, the coldness, or the anger. To observe with elevated consciousness is to silently ask, what is this person trying to protect in themselves? Because every defensive, aggressive, or distant behavior is a layer of protection. Something is being guarded, hidden, or held in fear. Maybe it's an old wound, a feeling of rejection, an unhealed memory. And when you access this broader vision, your field becomes less reactive and more compassionate. That doesn't mean you'll agree with everything. It means you won't get lost in the surface level drama. You'll see deeper. The intention behind your observation shapes the relational field. If your intention is to find blame, your gaze will be sharp. But if your intention is to see the essence, something softens in your eyes. You begin to seek, even in silence, the truth beyond the pain. You begin to see not just with your eyes, but with your heart. And this heart, when open, holds the power to dissolve invisible barriers. That's where judgment begins to dissolve. Because when you see the pain behind the defense, when you feel the humanity behind the flaw, judgment loses its grip. It doesn't vanish by force, it fades through clarity. You realize that judgment is a limited way of seeing. An elevated consciousness invites you to see in a complete way, including what's still wounded, but also what is awakening in the other. This kind of observation changes everything, not just within you, but in the dynamic between you and the other. Even without saying a word, the energy shifts. The other senses they are no longer being reduced to their worst version. They feel seen in a fuller, more truthful way. And often, that alone opens space for a new kind of relationship. A relationship where connection isn't built on agreement, but on presence. Where peace doesn't depend on being right, but on keeping the heart open. This technique doesn't require intellectual effort. It simply asks for presence, intention, and surrender. It's a daily practice of choosing to observe with more love than fear, more truth than expectation, more compassion than control. And in that choice, you become a channel of healing, not through what you do, but through who you are while observing. When you change your observation, the other feels it. There's something in human nature that goes beyond logic, beyond words, and far beyond visible behavior. It's a subtle system, a silent field of perception we all carry. Even if we're unaware of it, we feel what the other thinks about us, even when nothing is said. We feel when we're being judged. We feel when we're being seen with compassion. we feel when another's presence hardens us or softens us. That's why changing your observation changes everything, because the other feels it, in their body, in the field, in their heart. You may have never told the other person what you think of them, and yet they react with resistance, defensiveness, or distance. And you've probably noticed that when you begin to look at that person with less rigidity and more understanding, even without changing your words or actions, something between you starts to soften. That's not coincidence, vibration. The gaze carries energy, and that energy is picked up, interpreted, and mirrored back in subtle ways. Your observation is an emission. It's like a frequency that flows from you into the space of the relationship. And that frequency, even when silent, communicates something. When you hold a gaze of blame, even quietly, the other feels attacked. When you carry resentment and continue to observe the other through that lens, they feel like they're standing before a mirror that only reflects their worst. But when your gaze becomes more neutral, more present, more compassionate, the field begins to respond differently. Have you ever been with someone whose presence was so loving, so gentle, that everything in you relaxed? Who, without saying a word, seemed to say, "I see you, I recognize you, and I'm not here to harm you"? That's the effect of an awakened observer. And that's the same effect you can have on someone when you choose to change the way you see them. The magic lies in realizing that there's no need to force, to convince, to have endless conversations for the energy between two people to shift. Often it's simply the field that needs to be adjusted, and the field is shaped by the observer's consciousness. This is the quiet power of those who awaken, transforming the environment through the frequency of their gaze. Not a gaze that tries to control, but one that witnesses, that understands, that holds presence without pressure, and that creates an opening. Within that opening, the other may begin to feel safe enough to show up differently. They may even start to reflect on their own behavior, even if you say nothing, because the absence of judgment creates space for consciousness to bloom. There will be times when the other doesn't change, and that's okay. The point isn't to mold them to your will, but to break free from the pattern where your energy keeps feeding the conflict. When you stop seeing the other as a threat, you not only free yourself from fear, you also free them from the energetic prison your mind created. And that alone is a profound gift. Peace begins in the invisible gaze you choose to have, because that gaze sets the tone of the relationship. It says, without words, I'm here, not to fight you, but to see you. And that simple act, that state of being, is one of the greatest invitations to real transformation. We've reached the end of our journey, and maybe now you can see that the secret to resolving conflict was never in the other person. It was, all along, in the way you were observing them. When you change your gaze, you change the energy holding the relationship together. And when that energy shifts, the field begins to reorganize. It's not magic. It's consciousness vibrating on a new level. You don't need to convince anyone. You don't need to control or constantly defend yourself. All you need is to align your presence with empathy, with the intention of peace, and let the field respond to that silent choice. Here's a simple but powerful challenge. Choose a conflict in your life, and without saying anything, just observe it with more presence, more compassion, and more truth. See what changes, because love begins when judgment ends, and judgment ends when the observer awakens.